Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is the National Archives Foundation live stream program. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation, and we're so delighted to have you this evening, if you're on the East Coast, or this afternoon, if you're further west. Through this programming, we're excited to keep the National Archives doors open. While we might be physically closed here in Washington and around the country, we want you to enjoy what the archives has virtually. I hope every Tuesday and Friday you've been receiving our new emails, the American Experience and History Snacks for our young history buffs. So let me introduce our special guest, Alelia Bundles. I have known her for 7 years. Besides being a well-respected author and historian, she used to be my boss as the chair of the National Archives Foundation. So we've known each other and been through a lot. Alelia, first of all, how are you doing? How's your family doing?
I'm really feeling a sense of gratitude because we are healthy and have a roof over our heads. But, a lot of thoughts are out to people who are finding this a really challenging time.
Yes, and we're so pleased that folks are able to join from wherever they're coming. I'm just seeing here we've got Williamsburg, we've got Pennsylvania, we've got Burke, Virginia, Savannah, Georgia, of course, DC, we've got Palm Desert, California. Excellent. So we've got the country covered. This is terrific. Well, let's talk about you a little bit. The closest I get to fame, is most folks think I'm related to the famous football coach, which I always say is a distant uncle. Not sure how distant. But your great-great-grandmother was Madam C.J. Walker. So you must have been famous growing up as a kid in Indianapolis.
Yeah, ha, ha, ha. So my great-great-grandmother, Madam C.J. Walker, who founded this amazing hair care company, was the person the place where my mother went to work every day. My mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. And Madam Walker was born on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana, right after the Civil War. Lots of Civil War records in the National Archives, and developed a hair care product, and then became a millionaire and a philanthropist and employed thousands of women. So her story is pretty amazing, a pretty amazing American rags to riches story.
Absolutely. Well, I know we'll hear more about that and about her in a little bit. But you were a successful producer and executive in television. And so how do you go from the action-packed life to writing a biography?
So there's this picture that was just up of me with my family when I was a kid. You and I had talked about what it was like for me to be Madam Walker's great-great-granddaughter when I was growing up. So, it was great to have my mom at the company, and to really, nobody asked me to go into the family business. That was not my interest, but my parents, and we're showing this picture of me as a kid with my parents and my brother, because my real passion was writing. And both of my parents encouraged me to do that. I became a journalist, and I was telling lots of other people's stories. And all the while I had this pretty amazing story in my family. No books had ever been written about Madam Walker. So when I was in graduate school at Columbia in journalism, my advisor said, that's what you need to write about.
Oh, that's amazing. So talk us through, I see we've got an image from the company. Talk us through the company and some of your ancestors.
Sure.
We've got some pictures to share.
So Madam Walker, as I said, was born on the plantation in Delta, Louisiana in 1867, right after the Civil War. And again, I did research at the National Archives because the same plantation was where General Grant staged the siege of Vicksburg. But she was orphaned at 7, married at 14, to get a home of her own, to escape an abusive situation with a brother-in-law, moved from there to St. Louis, where her brothers were barbers, and joined St. Paul AME Church. And the women of the church began to give her a vision of herself. So by the time you see this picture of her in a Model T in Indianapolis, this journey that went from being a washerwoman, earning $1.50 a day, founding her company, moving to Denver, moving to Pittsburgh, and then ultimately ending up where you see her in Indianapolis, driving her Model T car. Then this is her daughter, Alelia Walker, who was really the apple of her eye and the motivation for her success. She was running the Pittsburgh office while Madam Walker was in Indianapolis, and persuaded her mother that they needed to have a presence in Harlem. So they bought a building in Harlem in 1913, just as Harlem was becoming the center for culture and politics for African Americans. And then you'll see in the next picture, my grandmother May, and you see my grandmother has very long braids, and the main product, the biggest seller for the Walker Company, was Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. And so May was a model for the Walker Company. And there's an interesting little twist to the story with May. She was adopted by Alelia Walker. And her biological family, the Walker women, had known her uncle, and they met her mother and her grandmother. Her father had recently died, and she was running errands for them and traveling with Madam Walker as a model. And Madam Walker was saying, "My wonderful hair grower." And you see this person with these wonderful long braids. So that's May. And then the next picture is F.B. Ransom, Madam Walker's attorney. And so for the people who've seen the Self-Made series, there is a character in the series, Freeman B. Ransom, and he was her trusted attorney. And I think one of the reasons that her legacy is remembered, in part because her daughter was in New York and she was very famous. She traveled all over the world, but also because she was smart enough to hire a really great lawyer. So people in the audience who are lawyers, or who have good lawyers, or who didn't have good lawyers, know the importance of a great lawyer.
Sure. So you mentioned the research piece of it. So I have an aunt who did this research of my family going back generations to Germany, Ireland, great records that are, definitely she spent time in the National Archives. She's delivered it to most of us of my generation in a great binder, all organized. So when you started this research, was it all organized? Tell me about the records, and how hard was it to get to the truth and the details?
It's in several different ways. One really important body of material, literally almost 50,000 records that were saved in part by Madam Walker's attorney, Freeman Ransom, and by her secretary, Violet Davis Reynolds, who had started working for the company in 1914 when she was a teenager, was my neighbor when I was growing up. And in the 1970s, Mrs. Reynolds still was working for the Walker Company, but she had saved all of these documents, and those documents were donated to the Indiana Historical Society. They've all been digitized. But when I first started doing my research, I had photocopies of those things. That was kind of the corpus of my research. Then I had things that my grandfather saved, family records, photographs, scrapbooks, books from Alelia Walker's library. And then I did some research, as I said, at the National Archives. And because Madam Walker, the first 38 years of her life, there are almost no records because she was a very poor person. But because she had been born on this plantation that was a staging area for the Siege of Vicksburg, the National Archives has tons of records that give me a sense of what was going on there. And of course, I think the National Archives is great for anybody who's doing genealogy. And you are very lucky that your relative organized things and put it into a notebook for you, because most people don't have that luxury.
Very grateful for that. So the National Archives, the Indiana Historical Society, I'm assuming attics, basements, other places that you were able to pull all these things together. So where's all that material now? Have you organized that? Are you the keeper of that? Or tell us a little bit about that.
So I have my own, what I call the Madam Walker Family Archives, which really is 2 rooms of my house. And files and, Hollinger boxes. And I keep finding things. Just really recently, I got a new trove of material. My grandfather was really the keeper of things for many, many years. After Alelia Walker died, my grandmother moved the things from her New York apartment to Indianapolis. And my grandfather put those things in storage, but I knew he hadn't paid the storage bill. So I thought, these are things I'll never see. And really, within the last 2 years, the nephew of the founder of the storage company found some things in the back of the warehouse. So
Wow.
amazing pictures of Alelia Walker in Egypt. So these things are in my house, soon to go to another archive as soon as I'm finished the book that I'm writing about A'Lelia Walker.
Excellent. Well, you have a chance to pitch that in a little bit. So I want to remind those of you who have joined us that we will be taking questions in a little bit. You can, as you're thinking of them, if you want to send them in the chat box now, that's the place to do it. You'll be sending them to the National Archives Foundation account, and we'll get those queued up. So we've got the history, we've got a little bit of the truth here of how the story goes. So let's now move from real life to the movies. In case there's some folks online who hasn't seen the series yet on Netflix, we do have the trailer, and so we're going to share the trailer to catch everybody up to speed on the movie.
It's time to tell my story. Seems like I was born to struggle. After a while, I guess I just lost hope. That's when my hair started falling out.
I'm going to help you.
My hair grew back, and so did my confidence. Maybe I could sell your product. I don't think sales is for you. Colored women will do anything to look like me, even if deep down they know they can't.
I ain't gonna let you keep beating up on yourself, yeah?
From now on, I'm doing my own hair, making my own hair grow. Come on.
Missy, I don't take orders no more. Lincoln freed me 40 years back.
That's why I'm gonna pay you.
And that's why you're my favorite daughter-in-law.
Sisters, let's talk about hair. They put us down, tell us we're ugly, make us feel ugly. Wonderful hair leads to wonderful opportunities. Mama, you sure on to something.
You can call me Queen.
I want a whole line of products, which is why I want to open my own factory.
There's such a thing as growing too fast.
We live in a man's world. It's just not our place.
I didn't come here to make sandwiches. I came here to do business.
Oh, I know. What you gonna do now, Sarah?
Don't let nobody steal your dream, Mama.
We need a plan B.
I'm not going back to laundry.
Now, we done all made sacrifices. You gonna do what's best for this family.
Hair is beauty. Hair is power.
Damn, Sarah, how big you wanna be?
Big. Carnegie, Ford, and Rockefeller put together.
I'm a ruler, yeah.
We gotta work harder. Be smarter. And dream big.
I'm a ruler, yeah.
Terrific. So let's get into how do we get to this point? I know you and I have talked before about you'd been approached about doing a movie about her life, and now here we are at Netflix. So how did this come about? Why did other ones fizzle and this one took off?
Right. It's a typical Hollywood story. It takes a while. And really the very first nibble on this was in the early 80s. Alex Haley wanted to do a miniseries. He was still riding the crest of Roots. So Alex died in 1992 without doing it. But in the process, I met his editor, Lisa Drew, for Roots. And Lisa acquired my book On Her Own Ground. And that is the book that ultimately became the inspiration for Self-Made. In the meantime, in those 20 years since that book was published, there were two other possibilities that fizzled. And then finally, in 2015, I was approached by Mark Holder of Wonder Street. And we now, 4 years later, have a series.
Terrific. So 4 years. And what was your role in that process? Obviously, you gave them the amazing story, but in terms of like developing the script, things like that, how do you, are you in the forefront, the background, saying yes, no? How does it work?
Yeah, well, so I was not as much involved in the creating the narrative as I really wanted to be and as I thought I would be. But my book was really the foundation for the research, and I had script review. So I reviewed the scripts. as the story was being developed and made some suggestions. And some of my suggestions were incorporated, and then some of them were not incorporated. So it was really creative license on the part of the script writer.
I see. Well, I think we'll probably touch on that a little bit more. So 4 years from the concept to the release last month, a couple weeks ago. Okay.
So in those 4 years, Octavia Spencer came on board, which was extremely thrilling to me. When Mark and Christine Holder had lunch with her, and she said she wanted to be not just the lead actor, but a producer. And then she brought LeBron James and Spring Hill into the mix. Now, I never met LeBron James. I have not met him to this day, but his company was involved. But having Octavia Spencer in that lead role is really incredible. And then, having Blair Underwood play Octavia Spencer's love interest, I think made many women happy. But I will also say that one of the things that meant the most to me is that he reached out to me during the early part of the filming to do research and to try to dig deeper on C.J. Walker. So that was great to know that he cared enough about the character that he wanted to know more.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I know we've got a clip of Octavia Spencer. I think it's probably one of the iconic scenes of the series. So let's play that.
I had a Cain versus Abel relationship with my hair. Bet some of y'all do too, huh? See, I was born free 2 years after emancipation. Was orphaned by 7. Married at 14, pregnant at 15, widowed by 20. Had to fend for myself and my baby girl. The only work I could find was in the fields or as a washerwoman. Didn't have time to take care of my hair. I know you know what I mean. Hard work on the farm, ain't it?
Wanted to work at the new hotel, but they say I ain't got the right look.
How many of y'all know what she's talking about?
Yes, indeed.
Put us down, don't give us nothing, tell us we're ugly, make us feel ugly. I tell you what, you come by my salon, I'll do your hair for free.
You got yourself a deal.
Wow, that's great. Do you have other sort of favorite scenes that sync up? I'm supposing in the script that you didn't hand over one of your records that you found and said, this is what she said in the market that day. So, but are there some scenes that really resonate with you, knowing the history so intimately?
Well, that is one of my favorite scenes, in part because it really shows how she empowered other women, and how part of her strength, I think, is that when she was still a poor washerwoman, like those women she was talking to, the women of her church in St. Louis really began to give this poor Sarah Breedlove a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. So she knew she had walked in the steps and in the shoes of those women. So I love seeing that. And I love seeing the array of faces and hairstyles and clothes. So I really think they nailed it with that particular scene. I did visit the set in Toronto. Everything was shot in Toronto, and I did spend a day on the set, and I watched director Demaine Davis, who's done a lot of Queen Sugar. People may know her name from that. But 2 scenes in particular. One was a scene with Kevin Carroll, who's playing F.B. Ransom, the attorney. And the scene centers around the lynching theme. And that was extremely emotional and really strong. And then there's another scene where Sarah Breedlove, Madam Walker, and C.J. Walker are in a hotel room. So I don't want to do any spoilers, but that was quite an emotional scene as well. But it was just a joy to be able to watch these great actors do their thing.
Mm-hmm. And what about the rest of the cast? Did you have any role in that? Was there any conversation? And we might get into this in some of the questions about colorism in the casting.
Yeah, the script writer and the showrunners really wanted to lean in on the colorism thing, but that is actually quite controversial. A lot of people really didn't, they thought it went overboard. And I would not have done quite as much of it. And in fact, Madam Walker in real life had a rival whose name was Annie Malone. And this character, the composite character in the film was Addie Monroe. So a lot of people wondered, was that supposed to be Annie Malone? And in real life, the women were about the same complexion. So the script writers really used a lot of creative license to dive into the colorism thing. So that was not something I would have done. You know, when you see Garrett Morris, a lot of people love Garrett Morris. They remember him from Saturday Night Live, and people who are too young to have seen him have seen clips. And that was a favorite character, Cleophas. Though in real life, I never found anything about C.J. Walker's father, but it was an interesting way to sort of talk about slavery. And then there's another character who people see at the bottom, Sweetness, played by Bill Bellamy. A lot of people love Bill Bellamy. That also is a character who didn't exist in real life. And then Kevin Carroll is in the center on the bottom row. He played F.B. Ransom, really, really strong actor who's done a lot of Broadway. So it's an interesting cast, a really sort of all-star cast.
Mm-hmm. So you're on scene a couple of on set a couple of times, but any fun behind the scenes tidbits before we get into the Q&A that you want to share?
You know, I will just say it was really lovely to be there. One of the things I loved about the series was the wigs. And I was able to meet the hairstylist and the people who had done the wigs, the people who had done the costumes. And the wigs, people don't realize, I mean, I've seen so many really bad Afro wigs in films that this was really great to see the beauty of the hairstyles. And you could see in many ways Sarah Breedlove's journey from a woman whose hair was falling out and who had the hair problems to these amazing hairstyles. And then there are all of these great natural hairstyles. So that was great fun for me to meet the people who had created those wigs and who were doing the hair. Especially because, you know, I grew up in a family where both of my parents worked in the hair care business. So this is something I, known from a child.
And anybody that knows you, depending on the day of the week or the event, you will show up with fantastic hair every time. So I think I remember between the first time I met you and the second time, your hair was completely different. And I actually thought I was meeting somebody else. I'm like, oh, they have the same name, but her hair is totally different. So it's always very impressive. So before we get to the questions, I have one that's come across several times that I'm going to give you. It's a softball, I'm sure. But I know you wanted to touch on the accuracy piece. We've talked about a couple little things. Was there anything else that I know some of the reviews have brought out different elements of it? You've touched on it, but is there more you'd want to say to that?
Well, I think we'll see what kinds of questions people have. But the thing that I think has been a real learning experience for me is that you can write, in my case, a 293-page nonfiction biography that's researched for 20 years. And you know that everything cannot go into 4 45-minute segments. And I think this happens a lot of times. The awards that we've given at the National Archives and our Records of Achievement, we have honored people like Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks who have done Hollywood versions of history that help people really learn history who might not sit down and read a book. Lin-Manuel Miranda, another one of our honorees. It gets people into the tent to pay attention, and you hope that they will dig more deeply. So this is a Hollywood version. Octavia Spencer embodies Madam Walker and her courage and tenacity and shows it how to build a business, but it's not a history lesson.
Fair enough. And I think Lin-Manuel's great quote from that evening was that he shot the bursar, sir. He was never going to give up that rhyme, even though it was completely historically inaccurate. So sometimes you go with the don't let a good story get in the way of the truth.
That's
right.
That's right.
So the first question, which I think has come through several times, did she really steal the formula?
Oh, God. So, it's complicated. The formula had been around for centuries. It's in medical textbooks and pharmacists. It was really very simple at a time when most people didn't have indoor plumbing. People didn't wash their hair very often. They had really bad dandruff, and I won't go into details, but it was essentially Vaseline with sulfur in it. So the formula had been around for a long time. Sarah Breedlove's brothers were barbers, so she learned something about hair care from them. She did sell Annie Malone's Poro products for a while. And then when she moved from St. Louis to Denver, she was a cook for a pharmacist who helped her also mix up her own formula. So it's complicated.
And by no means, I assume, she wasn't the only one with some sort of hair care product. She just made it obviously into an amazing business.
Yeah, because there were, and the Annie Malone, Madam Walker, rivalry is really deep. But there were people before either of them who were making similar products. Cuticure is actually kind of a very similar thing that had been around since the 1880s. But Madam Walker really stands out in part because she was such a great marketer and because she knew how to train women, empower women. And I think over a period of time, the hair products in a way became a means to an end. When she started having her conventions, her first convention in 1917, she had brought 200 women together, and she was saying to them, not only do I want you to sell hair care products, but I want you to use part of that money as philanthropists to better your community, to be politically active. And at the end of their convention, they sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson, urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. And that's in the National Archives.
Excellent. Well, let me get to some of the other questions here. We'll probably jump around, I'm sure. Did the first house really burn as was shown in the series?
No, that was Hollywood melodrama.
Okay. Can you tell us about the huge factory complex that she owned?
So she owned a factory in Indianapolis, and it was really, she bought a house in Indianapolis, and behind the house was essentially a stable and a warehouse, and she turned that into a salon and to a factory. So it wasn't the kind of complex that people saw in Self-Made. And then she opened an office in New York and a beauty school, a beauty salon there. And then she began to acquire property in Indianapolis before she died in 1919. And in 1927, a beautiful block-long Flatiron building was built in Indianapolis with a factory and a theater and the corporate offices and a ballroom and a beauty salon and a drugstore. And that building is still standing, and it's a National Historic Landmark called the Madam Walker Legacy Center.
It's wonderful. Again, I want to encourage people to send us their questions to the National Archives Foundation in the chat. I've got a few more here. How much do you know of Madam Walker's siblings?
So she had 5 siblings. Her older siblings were all enslaved. They were with their parents on the Burney plantation in Delta, Louisiana. And her brothers, interestingly for me, her older brothers were moved from Delta, Louisiana to St. Louis in the late 1870s, and they were part of what was called the Exodusters movement. So it was one of the first major migrations of African Americans. Their family minister, Curtis Pollard, had been a state senator. So during Reconstruction, 90% of their parish was Black. That meant there were a lot of Black elected officials. And he was chased out of Madison Parish by the Ku Klux Klan in 1879. And her brothers followed him to St. Louis. Again, records that are in the Library of Congress and the National Archives. So I was really able to rely on those Senate hearings about that Exodusters movement in order to tell their story. Once they got to St. Louis, they joined St. Paul AME Church, which had a history of taking in recent migrants, and then they learned how to be barbers.
Well, that's a good segue to this question. What surprised you or amazed you the most in your research?
So I, just like other people who are my age who had heard of Madam Walker, we knew, she started a hair care company, and that was kind of the whole story. But as I began to do research about her, I discovered that she was an international entrepreneur. She was a pioneer of the modern hair care industry, but that she then, once she had some influence, she used that influence as a philanthropist and as a really outspoken political activist, speaking out on behalf of Black soldiers during World War I, participating in the NAACP's anti-lynching movement. And again, I keep coming back to records of the National Archives. In College Park, there are some classified materials from World War I. She and Ida B. Wells, who was just posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize yesterday, they were spied upon by a black spy for the War Department, and they were called Negro subversives because of their political militancy, which just made me love her even more.
I bet. I bet. So getting to this idea of truth or fiction, the tense scene between Madam Walker and Booker T. Washington, Hollywood, or is there something there?
Yeah, mostly Hollywood. I mean, in fact, Madam Walker and Booker T. Washington did get off to a rocky start. So there's a real drama there, real life drama. He was the most powerful Black man in America, and she wanted his endorsement. So she attended his conference, but it was a little different or a lot different from what you see in the film. She went to his Tuskegee campus uninvited and kind of charmed her way in. And then she appeared at his 1912 National Negro Business League convention. And she had just contributed $1,000 to the building fund of a YMCA in Indianapolis. So he knew who she was. He had met her before. But when she got to the conference, she was ready to speak and he said no. But it's different from what you see in the film. And I think I like the reality more because she waited until that last day of the convention when he didn't give her an opportunity to speak. And she stood up and gave a great speech saying, I'm a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South, and I have built my own factory on my own ground. So that conversation behind the scenes never happened where he's telling her women should not be out in front of men. And in fact, what I think is a lovely resolution is that when he came to Indianapolis for the dedication ceremony to be the keynote speaker at the YMCA, Madam Walker sent her chauffeur to the train station to pick him up, and he was a guest in her home. So by the time he died in 1915, they were friends.
Okay. Speaking of famous people, what about the John D. Rockefeller component?
You know, that's a great Hollywood story. That line, I want to be bigger than Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller put together. That's a great Hollywood line and a quotable line. But, you know, that didn't happen. In fact, Madam Walker's estate, Villa Lawaro, is in Irvington, New York, in Westchester County. And Rockefeller's beautiful estate, Kykuit, is about 5 miles away. They never met in real life, and she didn't walk over to his, to his estate while he was he skeet shooting or playing croquet? I can't, whatever. But no, that didn't really happen. But it is a way to show that she was asserting herself by building a home in Westchester County in one of the wealthiest communities in America.
Mm-hmm. And so did you say that, does your family own the Walker Building in Indianapolis?
So the Madam Walker Legacy Center is a nonprofit center. It was the headquarters for the company, and then it became a nonprofit entity in the early 80s.
Okay. So at the time, how was she portrayed in the media, in the press?
So, the Black press wrote about her every week, and she was really very smart, again, in her marketing and in developing relationships with publishers and editors. So, and she advertised a lot in the Black press, and some of the publishers said that she helped keep them in business. So she was very favorably covered. And then there were white newspapers who wrote about her. When she built her mansion in Irvington, New York, she was in the Sunday New York Times Magazine. But there were some, sort of racial slurs. It was as if the white press just really couldn't quite get its mind around this successful woman. So when now you see the New York Times is rewriting these obituaries of people who were neglected, she actually had an obituary, but I would love to see one where there's no racial slur with her in the headline.
Well, and that leads us to a couple of sort of family questions here about your research. And I'll give you two and let you sort of answer them. How was she close with her brothers? And can you talk a little bit about her adopted daughters?
Sure. So yeah, she was very close with her brothers, especially the oldest one, Alexander, who really seemed to be the leader of the family. But her brothers died within a quick succession, within about 6 years of each other. So that really upended her life and kind of left her adrift, though there were other people to whom she had become close, women who were her friends and her mentors. But yes, she had been close to her brothers when they were still living. But the loss of her brothers had a big impact on her. The story of her Alelia Walker, her daughter, her only child, was married 3 times, and that's another storyline in the film. There's a real life drama because she had 2 boyfriends, and that was real life drama between mother and daughter. Both were doctors, both were handsome. Madam Walker didn't trust one, and she adored the other one. And of course, her daughter liked the one she didn't trust better. I mean, it's like typical story. But she was married 3 times and had no biological children. But when Lelia and Madam Sarah were in St. Louis at St. Paul AME, they had become very friendly with many people, but among them was a man whose name was Hammond. And when they moved to Indianapolis, when Madam moved to Indianapolis, coincidentally, his mother lived across the street from them. And one of her daughters, who lived nearby in Noblesville, had a daughter whose husband had just died. And those were the parents of my grandmother, May. So May was somebody who was a good student on the honor roll, but from a poor family. And she started running errands and being a model and traveling around. So they persuaded her mother to allow them to legally adopt her with the promise that they would educate her. So in fact, Spelman is mentioned in the film, and she went to Spelman and she became president of the company later.
And you mentioned before that she was sort of spied on, as being militant for her role. Did she have a role in the suffragist movement?
She had some role. She wasn't a member, as far as I can tell, of any of the national organizations, but she did host meetings of suffragists in Indianapolis. She had one of the friends of one of her friend's daughters, named Carrie Barnes, was really involved in the suffrage movement in Indiana and had founded the Black women's chapter of the Indiana Suffrage Organization. And Madam Walker hosted meetings of those suffragists in her home.
What about her products internationally? Were they well known?
Sure. Her products were sold in the Caribbean and Central America. Actually, in 1913, she traveled to Cuba, Panama, Haiti, Jamaica, and Costa Rica. And Alelia, her daughter, traveled to Panama in 1919 to try to expand the company. And then there were students who came to the Walker Beauty School in Indianapolis from Liberia and from Ghana. So there was an international component to the products. And I mean, just sort of coincidentally, the MCJW line of hair care products that's now available, the founder of Sundial Brands is originally from Liberia, Richelieu Dennis. And when Rich came to the United States to go to college in the late 80s, he already had heard of Madam Walker, and years later wondered what had happened to the product line and acquired the trademark, and then now makes the MCJW products.
Mm-hmm. And through your research, are you in touch with, or were in touch with, when you're doing the research, with any of the women who sold her products? Are there gatherings? Is there an email group, text group?
Well, fortunately, I am in touch. There's a group called the National Beauty Culturist League, which just had its 100th anniversary last year. I spoke at their convention, and the members of that group were the people who really rallied in 1998 to help me get the Walker stamp. So the graduates of the Walker Beauty School, they're sort of, there are only a few of them left, but they've always been stalwarts and real supporters of anything that I do with Madam Walker.
Excellent. So the last one, I have a geography question for you. Is Ransom Place in Indianapolis named for Freeman Ransom?
Absolutely. So people who know Indianapolis, if you know the center of town, the Walker Building, the Walker Legacy Center, and what was the Black neighborhood at the turn of the last century on Indiana Avenue, there is a neighborhood behind it called Ransom Place, and it absolutely is named for Freeman B. Ransom, Madam Walker's attorney and longtime general manager.
That's wonderful. And then I'm going to finish up with one question here for you. For those who have tuned in today, what should they take away besides truth and fiction from Hollywood and making sure they get a copy of your book, what should they really be inspired by and take away from Madam C.J. Walker's legacy and her story?
You know, what I hope people will remember about Madam Walker is that she's a woman who overcame tremendous odds. And we are in a very challenging time right now, and that to be able to be inspired by someone like that and to see that her courage, her tenacity, and I think really importantly that she empowered other women. She knew what had been done for her, that other people had mentored her, had made, had pushed her forward, and she wanted to do that for other women. And then as she was becoming wealthy, and certainly after she was wealthy, she really wanted to use her money to make a difference as a patron of the arts and as a person who provided scholarships and who was involved in political issues.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank those of you on the line. If you want to give us a round of applause, a quiet applause. Thank you, Alilia. This has been wonderful. If you are interested in her book, I'm fortunate enough to have acquired one of the new copies. But you can go to our e-store at nationalarchivestore.org, get a copy of that. And while you're there, you might as well peruse some of the other collections of wonderful things we have. The archives, as you know, the Archives Museum is closed, and thus our physical shop is closed, but our e-store is open, and we'd love for you to help us keep the e-store booming while we're making our way through this. But you can get signed copies of the book through our e-store. In addition to that, before we go, I want to thank all of our members and donors who joined us today. There's a good number of you. Thank you. If you're not a member, you can go to our website, archivesfoundation.org, and become a member. Our members and our donors are really who power us as a foundation to support the National Archives and connecting our history and the records that the National Archives has with the public. You can always go to archives.gov to really learn what the National Archives is doing, but we like to augment that. We like to shout it from the rooftops. So those of you who are donors and members, thank you for being a part of what we are. So, and lastly, if you like today, wait till next week. We have just secured Brad Meltzer and Josh Minch, the authors of the Lincoln Conspiracy. It just came out today. So they'll be with us next Thursday at 5 o'clock. Brad's always a hoot. If you don't know him, it will be entertaining. So I hope you'll sign up. We'll have the registration up soon. So on behalf of the National Archives Foundation, I want to thank you for joining us today. And until our next program, be safe and be well.